where does this leave Labour? Because there are some Labour voices saying this is a Conservative problem more than a Labour problem. And there are clearly Labour voices saying how we pivot now really matters. Just reflect on that for me for a minute or two.
Well, the answer to you is that reform are indeed more of a problem for the Conservatives for Labour, but that doesn't mean to say that Labour doesn't have its own problems. I mean, the evidence of the opinion polls, and indeed, if you start analysing the local election results, it's perfectly clear that Reform are still finding it easier to pick up voters off the Conservatives. Essentially, one crucial headline from last Thursday is that essentially Reform have pretty much now destroyed the last remnants of the pro-Brexit coalition that Boris Johnson assembled back in 2019. The people who are voting Reform, the areas that voted Reform are heavily those folk who voted Leave in 2016. That doesn't mean to say they're simply voting on the basis of Brexit, but the point is that people who are in favour of Brexit tend to be concerned about immigration. They tend to be more socially conservative on things like transgender, and they're the kinds of folk who will feel that the kinds of celebrations that are going over VE Day are a good thing and are concerned that other people in our society don't acknowledge Britain's past enough. So they're definitely getting a niche market, and it's a niche market which means they're drawing more voters to the Conservatives. Labour are losing some votes to Reform, and it's worth bearing in mind that even in the average place that voted, even in the places that voted Remain, Reform could still pick up about 20% of the vote or that. But the polls indicate that Labour isn't just losing votes to Reform. Would that it were that simple for Labour? It's losing just as many votes to the Greens. It's losing just as many votes to Liberal Democrats. It's even losing some votes to the Conservatives. And again, if you actually look to see, the relationships between the party performances and local elections, where the Greens do well, it's Labour and indeed the Liberal Democrats who tend to lose out most. So we've got two blocks in our society. We've got Conservative and Reform voters. We've got Labour, Liberal Democratic and Green voters, amongst whom there's a lot of competition. Labour, of course, is trying to stand in the middle of those two blocks. Standing in the middle is no longer as comfortable as it was in our politics, because you can no longer assume that there aren't any enemies to your left or enemies to your right. And Labour are essentially, therefore, seeing the coalition that they put together to win the 2024 election. It's fragmenting, but it's fragmenting in different directions.
And what is it they say about standing in the middle of the road? That you eventually just get run over, which is what happened on Thursday night. Well, for the Tories, that happened on Thursday night.
I think in the end, my response to the internal Labour debate, insofar as anybody would want to listen to me, is I think the thing that Labour needs to worry about above all is actually the pattern of its own performance. Where did Labour lose ground above all? In places where they were previously strongest. Now, there weren't that many of them in these local elections because it was predominantly in Tory.
Well, Runcorn is a
Labour's vote
big
fell
example.
away most strongly in such heartlands as were electing. And that, in a sense, I think suggests to me, at least in part, we go back to the problem with the Labour Party under Keir Starmer that's been there for long since before it went into government, which is, what is this government about? What is its story? What is its narrative? What are the kind of country it's trying to create? That's always been something that voters have not been clear about. And because of some of the decisions that have been made that have clearly resonated with people, in the absence of any story, it's been the cut in the winter fuel allowance, it's been more recently the cuts in disability. So people don't have a sense of what this government is about, but above all, they are therefore surprised that apparently a Labour government is about doing these things. So in the absence of a narrative, Labour doesn't actually have any defence other than saying, well, it was the Tories' fault. For doing these things.
Well, I'm increasingly getting calls and texts when we talk about Labour and the government, describing them as being about punching down, based on those things you've just alluded to there, the PIP payments and the winter fuel allowance. But it's interesting, isn't it, that business of what am I about? What Boris Johnson proved when he got that big 80-seat majority is that you can be decidedly about almost one thing and convince a huge coalition of people to come with you. And yet there's so much vacillation from the Labour government, isn't there, on and I think we saw it in the lead up to the general election. And of course, it didn't stop them getting that big majority. But given the position you've described them as, I think accurately, as being in, and losing votes to the Lib Dems and the Greens as much as to Reform, the decision is, as Louise Haigh describes, I guess, isn't it? They have to decide which way do we go, because we can't just keep going every way. We have to choose at least something that looks like a way.
So I think my answer to you, therefore, and the implication of what I'm saying, Sheila, is you don't tack to the left or to the right, you go forward. But the point is, people don't have a sense of the direction in which the Labour Party want to go.
What that looks like.
Or another analogy I would give you is that, I think one of the ways in which one might characterise this Labour government is essentially saying, hi, we're the plumbers. We are going to deal with the numerous leaks that have occurred in your building. Whereas I think what people want out of a government is not a government that says, oh, we're going to fix the things that have gone wrong. They also want to say, well, actually, I want a builder or an architect. I want somebody who's going to tell me, to give me a new house, to tell me what it's going to look like. And I think the problem with Labour is focusing so much on saying we're going to deal with the problems the Conservatives inherited. People don't have any sense of, well, beyond that, what?
When you do your polling, away from election times, how strong is the group of voters that says, oh, it's early days, yeah, they've made a couple of mistakes, but let's give them time? Because that's what Wes Streeting was saying at the weekend, that people need to see the fruits of our labour, small l, and they haven't yet.
Oh, sure. I mean, look, you only have to look at what happened in the last Parliament to realise that voters can shift quite dramatically. In the first 2 years of the last Parliament, the Conservatives basically dominated the opinion polls, and then along came Partygate, and the rest is history. So sure, we cannot say that at the moment this means that Labour are inevitably heading for defeat. I think the point is that the weaknesses in Labour's position were evident last summer. They only got 35% of the vote, despite that large majority. People weren't clear what they stood for. What Labour did say they were going to do, we're going to deliver economic growth. Well, for reasons to some degree, partly out of their control, they have found that very difficult and certainly haven't been able to deliver it in the kind of timescale that they implied. They've made some progress on the health service, but the waiting lists are still very high. And those Labour have quite correctly identified that those are the two issues that they have to deal with. But arguably, in focusing on that entirely, they have, in a sense, given themselves too demanding a task, because it was never likely to be achieved in the short run. And therefore, people are saying, well, hang on, life doesn't seem to be any better.
Is their biggest question now to tax or not to tax?
Well, some of us, I think, certainly took the view that, if you were reading the reports of the Office of Budget Responsibility, that, first of all, certainly the second of the national insurance cuts that were implemented by the last government, they were basically unfunded. We increased borrowing in order to do that. And then, of course, Labour, finding the fiscal situation difficult, as was almost inevitable, then effectively had to reverse that cut, but it couldn't do so directly. It had to do so indirectly through putting a tax on employers. But that doesn't have the same consequences as a taxing on employees. It's clearly something that is at risk, at least, of curbing employment, of making it more difficult for employers. And to that extent, at least, as it were, Labour's position on tax has constrained its room for manoeuvre in a way that perhaps has not necessarily seemed to be wise. Saying you're not going to increase the rates of income tax, the rates of VAT, or the rates of national insurance does constrain you.
Ties your hands, yeah.
There was always a get-out clause, which is they're not increasing the thresholds at which you start to pay income tax. So in practice, income tax is still going.
Yeah,